Let me just introduce one person we have here who's somewhat special to us. You're all special. This person is a member of our board of counselors, and that's Ambassador Frank Baxter, and there he is over here. Thank you, Frank, for coming. We're very grateful to the family of Earl V. Pullias for making this lecture series possible and for endowing our Pullias Center for Higher Education. Dr. Earl Pullias was one of the founding faculty members of USC's Department of Higher Education in 1957. The university created the Pullias Lecture in his honor, and I'm quoting from the gift, to add to the ongoing dialogue on significant topics in higher and post-secondary education. And I think that I haven't been to all 40. Is there anyone here who's been to all 40 lectures? I should ask that. Okay, but I've been to 18 of them, and I think our speaker today is going to continue well with this tradition of looking at important topics that colleges and universities grapple with. Those of you familiar with the Pullias Center know its commitment for improving college outcomes for underserved students, while also helping colleges and universities improve their own performances as institutions of higher ed is very important. It is the only named and endowed center of higher education within a top U.S. research university. As the longest-serving research center at USC, dating back to its founding in 1996, the Pullias Center has led by example both within Rossier and across hundreds of post-secondary institutions throughout our country. Like the Pullias Center, USC Rossier is a mission-driven school of ed. While we attempt to interrogate systems of power that shape policies and practices, we have applied that same rigor to looking at our own practices. That's why we created a new mission statement last fall that is focused more squarely on equity and on helping practitioners, scholars, and policymakers to advance educational equity for all. We share our speakers' commitment to adopting a new lens, to changing our own perspectives, to scrutinizing our own practices in the service of transforming institutions and the lives of the diverse student populations that we serve. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Adriana Kezar, who is co-director along with Dr. Bill Tierney of the Pullias Center. She also directs the Delphi project on changing faculty and student success. Dr. Kezar is one of the nation's leading experts on issues of leadership and change in higher education, diversity and equity, and adjunct and non-tenure track faculty. She's also the PI of the largest private grant-supported study in our school's history, the 6-year, $6.2 million project, almost gave you a B there, $1 million project, yeah, funded by the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, focuses on a college success program in Nebraska. She has received a number of honors, including the 2017 Research Advancement Award from the Association for the Study of Higher Education, and in the fall she will become the Dean's Professor in Higher Educational Leadership here at USC Rossier. Please help me welcome Dr. Adriana Kezar.
Thank you, Karen, and again, welcome everyone. We're really pleased to see you here, and I am so pleased to be able to introduce Sarita Brown. She surely represents the type of leader that the Pullias Lecture is meant to celebrate. When I worked in Washington, D.C., she was a name that I heard whenever conversations turned to equity and diversity. She is President of Excelencia in Education, a not-for-profit organization accelerating Latino success in higher education by linking research, policy, and practice. She has spent more than 3 decades at prominent educational institutions at the highest levels of government, working to implement effective strategies to raise the achievement and opportunity for low-income and minority students. She started her career at the University of Texas at Austin by building a national model to try to improve graduate education. And she came to our nation's capital to work with educational associations, and she served as the executive director for the White House Initiative for Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans under Bill Clinton and the Education Secretary, Richard Riley. In 2004, she applied her talents and experience to co-found Excelencia. And she's been a collaborator and worked to create allies for Latino students and change policies, making a difference. And her efforts have been recognized by many, including the Harold McGraw Prize for Education in Innovative Thinking, Strong Leadership, and Accomplishment by Example, the National Association for Student Personnel Administrators, and the American Association for Women. And in receiving the McGraw Award, she was noted for her unique abilities to combine research, policy, and practice. She asks us all to examine the poor conditions for Latino students in the United States. In terms of research, Excelencia publishes important work, including they do 2 annual reports, one on the conditions of Latinos in education and what works for Latinos in higher education. They also have many timely reports, such as from Capacity Success, HSIs, Title V, and Latino students. And I really recommend that all of you look at their wonderful resources and research. Sarita shifted the dialogue about Latino students and said it's time to move from just looking at the trends and the rising numbers, researching to understand this population, and instead we need to engage and help make them successful. She focuses on strategic information for decision makers and is extremely data-driven in her policy and practice work, something we at the Pullias Center really appreciate. I asked a few people to comment about Sarita, their observations from knowing her personally. Everyone talked about her as a visionary, with a big exclamation mark. They also mentioned her as driven, as an innovative thinker in ways to support Latino students. Many commented on how she's also deeply connected to the Latino community on the ground. Others noted how her passion for helping Latino students is contagious. So contagious that no one can say no to her requests. And on a side note, she is known for throwing a tamale latke party around the holidays, which people really love. So without further ado, I want to present to you Sarita Brown.
It's a pleasure to be here. To be on a university campus by itself when you live in Washington, D.C. is a delight. And to have the opportunity to contribute to a tradition that's 40 years old, which has as its purpose the continuation of meeting challenges through education. This is a year of anniversaries. And I'm going to tell you some that motivated me as I got on the plane to come here. 50 years ago this month, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission for its chairman, and appointed by then President Lyndon Johnson, issued a seminal report on racial division and disparities in the United States. The report was produced in response to civil unrest that raged across the country, and in the 1968 report, the commission concluded that our nation is moving towards 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. LBJ's personal understanding of the impact of racial and ethnic divisions on the opportunity pathway in America started early in his career. In 1928, he started his first job in South Texas, in a small town named Cotula, where when he was 20 years old. Long before he ever thought about being president, Johnson spent a year as a teacher in what was then a Mexican school. He recalls the students were so poor that the children would go through the garbage pile, shaking the coffee grounds from the grapefruit rinds and sucking the rinds for the juice that was left. He was motivated as an educator to engage them and serve them, And as a person of meager salary, he used what he had to buy volleyballs and softballs. LBJ had that attitude because of what he saw that was real, and he responded to it. 50 years ago, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission held a 6-day hearing in San Antonio, Texas, to examine civil rights, looking at Mexican Americans in the Southwest. The hearings were held at Our Lady of the Lake University and examined education, employment, the administration of justice, and economic issues. As the commission did its work, there were people in San Antonio among the leadership that objected to the kinds of issues that were being discussed. Reverend Theodore Herzberg, president of Notre Dame University and vice chairman of the commission, responded, "We are not an enforcement agency. We make reports to the president and to Congress, and we do it to hold up a mirror to the community and let them tell us if there are any problems and what we should be doing." And being here in Los Angeles this month, I could not possibly be talking about anniversaries and not talk about 50 years ago this month, students at 5 high schools in the Los Angeles East Side and their supporters protested against prejudice and inequality in the Los Angeles Unified School District. At the time, students were forbidden from speaking Spanish in school, and many were being steered towards vocational careers instead of college. The East LA walkouts, they were, by the time that the walkouts culminated, involving 20,000 students, including African Americans, Asian Americans, and whites, and they'd walked out of classes across Los Angeles. The actions ultimately led to educational reforms to the nation's second largest school district. This is a year of anniversaries, significant anniversaries, and 50 years is a long time. And yet, for all that has happened, we all know that as much as we've made progress, there are still challenges to meet. And most importantly, that at this moment in this country, we must recognize the severe and extreme issues of conflict over civil rights, racial and ethnic relations, and economic disparities. Who or what can be a force to help people navigate an inequitable opportunity landscape and propel a civil society? These are the ideas. These are the challenges. These are the opportunities that have stirred my thinking, my hopes, my anger, and my ambitions since I was an undergraduate many years ago. Through the years, this conversation and the terms and strategies have changed. Minority recruitment, access and success, diversity, inclusion, race, ethnicity, income, need, and today, equity. While the terms have evolved and the legal context continues to change, efforts continue to be fueled by a fundamental question: who belongs? Who belongs? As participants, it begins with an awareness about who's in the room, who's at the table, in the classroom, at the decision-making process, and a consideration of who is missing. That's how it worked for me when I was 21 years old, and I looked around the campus of one of the state flagship institutions, a public institution, and saw a few Mexican-American, Chicano, and Black students. My choice was to start working in higher education by building the Minority Affairs Division in the Office of Graduate Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. For 15 years, I was able to work together with committed faculty and dedicated staff to construct recruitment and retention strategies that mitigated the dominance of the memory of segregation and the legacy of scholarship agendas that refuse to acknowledge the contributions of Mexican American and Black talent. The work that I had the privilege of beginning with was work that focused on the recruitment of graduate students, focused on the future. Our North Star was the promise of shaping the academy with the talent of people who would come to their scholarship with a different sensibility, one that could hold its own in any discipline, but one that would absolutely be anchored by a broad vision of who belongs. By 1993, UT was ranked #1 in awarding doctoral degrees to Latino students and top 20 in awarding doctoral degrees to African American students. Now, I tell you that not only because soy tejana and bragging is an art form in Texas, but I tell you this because the experience proved to be a life lesson about the role an individual, a collection of individuals, can play in creating positive change regardless of the size of an organization and the limitation of resources. I'm saying this is a year of anniversaries. It is the 25th anniversary of the start of my 2-year stay in Washington, D.C. Why do I stay in Washington, D.C.? Because I found a lot to do, and I found very good people to do it with. And if I do my job well, I'll make a case that even you might think about what can be done in Washington, D.C., and do the kinds of things that we together must build. Informed by the lessons of my 15 years at an academic institution, I came to join an organization. Along the way, as Professor Kezar told you, I had an amazing opportunity, and that was to spend 3 years in the Clinton administration with a job that was breathtaking. The work was to work with 24 federal agencies, to work directly with principals in the White House, was to take on this idea of there were things that the government can do, there were things that agencies could do, there were things to be done that could change the rate of success for Hispanics. And it was anchored by a recognition that it wasn't exclusively a social justice discussion, it was an economic discussion. It was one that recognized that the growth of the Latino community was, in fact, an asset for the country. Learning as I did about how government practices and what it is that a small team of people could do, it was a validating experience because the process of change fundamentally was the same. You begin with baseline information. So in 1997, we looked at what federal agencies were doing, what they knew, how they were spending their money, and what were the strategies that were yielding better results. You also made an assessment about organizational proficiency. Now in 97, many people in federal agencies knew very little about how to interact with the Hispanic community. I'm not saying that to be insulting, it's factual. They were unclear who Hispanics were. They were not convinced that the strategies that they were offering would be useful, but they were at a loss to figure out how to adapt them and what would be the right way to begin to build relationships and strategies. That proficiency is proficiency that can be taught, and that was part of what we did over those 3 years. It also required assessing and aggregating the assets. Now, you're at the federal government, you think that's a whole lot of everything, you got it all. I think anybody who's worked in a big organization knows conceptually you may have it all, but what do you have access to and how can you direct it? And so the question really became, within a big structure, how do you build the necessary resources to then catalyze the change? That requires scaling your aspirations. You take yourself seriously and you want to have an effect. How quickly do you seek to make a change? How big is the impact that you want to have? Those are questions that you ask early so that what you do succeeds. Because as you want to build momentum, you build it on success. And within that, you execute thoroughly and well, and you plan to continually assess the impact that you have and what more is needed. Now, I say these things almost in management bullet format because regardless of the sector that any of us wants to affect change in, these are the fundamentals. You start by making an assessment. You calibrate what you're in a position to do. You evaluate whatever it is that you're offering, and you reserve your stamina to fight again another day. That's what I've learned in the years from UT Austin to the federal government. Within that, though, in Washington, D.C., came a moment that was quite seminal for Deborah Santiago, who is the co-founder of Excelencia, and myself. The two of us had met when we were at the White House Initiative. I was smart enough to recruit her to be our deputy, and we experienced the release of the 2000 census. I say it that way because it was really quite stunning to watch people be very comfortable announcing that they were learning that there were Latinos in this country, that we are everywhere, not just in California, Texas, Florida, and New York, that we are young, and we are. Then and now, Latino children comprise a fourth of all school districts. And in terms of the ratio of Latino young people to Latino adults, our ratio is one which all other populations are dwarfed by. Whatever we are seeing in the proportion of the Latino population in a school system or in colleges and universities, it is only a prediction of what is coming. We are vast, we are growing, and what we know is that we are eager to participate. We are ready to engage, and that we believe deeply that education is the pathway. Now, for me, the synergy between watching America, and particularly decision makers and leaders in federal agencies, show me with pride that they saw in the USA Today numbers, and did I know, and my reaction to that was simply that if this was a discovery for them at that moment, that there was probably going to be a lag time before they were ready to act and before they were ready to move. And reconciling that with what had been the experience I had had as a young professional. We've been talking about demographics for 30 years. We've been talking about the seismic shifts that now some people are experiencing for the first time. And we've been, depending on the speaker, we've been promoting a method for engaging this talent and this energy. I remember well Alfredo de los Santos, community colleges. I was, in fact, here right before the event began. Richard Navarro and I are talking about when was the last time we saw each other. It might have been AH, no, it was that someone else I walked in, and we're talking about it could have been at the American Association for Higher Education. I remember as a young professional sitting in the audience when Alfredo got up to the podium, and in that, if any of you have, if you've had the pleasure of meeting him, all due respect, my invitation. And if you haven't, you'll cut me some slack. So he's a gregarious man with a hearty sense of humor who can cut through to what matters all the time. And he gets up there at a vast conference of 2,000 people, and he's looking out on the room, and he's saying, I see a lot of white hair, and I see a lot of bald, and I see a... So let me tell it to you plain. When you need Social Security, our little chicanitos are the ones who are going to get it for you. And he laid it out straight. I mean, he didn't just do it in that funny way. He also did it with statistics. And since that time, Steve Murdoch, he's been doing it for years, a demographer of great skill, who not only did it in Texas, but then he came and ran the Census Bureau. He's returned to Texas. these numbers continue to be produced. And we continue to hear the assertion of the potential for enlightened self-interest. I'm at the point where, orale, let's get on with it. How much more enlightenment do we need? That is what ultimately became, for Deborah and myself, a recognition that it wasn't simply a matter of playing a role quietly in a process that would simply change or roll out, because demography itself is not making anything happen. Demography means raw human talent. In my language, it means the potential. But the engagement is when we start talking about the changes in our society, in our structures. And for those of us who saw this as a bright potential rather than something to fear, we believed that what we needed to do was to speed up the framing process and to set people ready to be able to act, even if we disagree, but to act. So we decided that we would be an information source, so that someone who comes to a formal responsibility where knowledge about Latino students would be part of their job, and in the privacy of their experience with their computer, they could look at our website and, as my colleague likes to say, deal with ignorance abatement. They could be informed about basic information, who Latinos are, how we function, how we participate, and most importantly, how we engage in education. It is factual that we are the second largest racial and ethnic group in the country and growing, that we are the youngest, among the youngest ethnic and racial groups, that still to this day we have lower educational attainment rates, and nonetheless, we are this country's future workforce and leadership. Now, the last thing on demography is the statement may be, we will overcome, tongue-in-cheek, we will overwhelm. Neither of those is true. We will fully participate when we get on the pathway to education. And for the framing of these issues, Excelencia sought not only to give the facts, but also to deal with the myths. To say from our very earliest that though there are many who would like to assert that the Latino community in the United States is primarily immigrant, undocumented, Spanish-speaking, and high school dropouts, the data when we began in 2004 and to this day remains that the majority of the Latino student population in this country is US born. The majority are US citizens. The majority are English dominant, and still, as much as we want to emphasize improvement, the majority of Latino students in this country are high school graduates. So this premise of where to come into this and what to do is one based on assets. It is one based on strength. It is one based on positive momentum. But we still return to that question I asked myself a long time ago. Who and what can help people navigate an inequitable opportunity landscape to become part of a thriving civil society? We chose the higher education sector. We put our stake in the ground at that juncture, even though we recognize that equity is best addressed in the design studio. What do I mean by that? If all of us could wave a magic wand, that would mean that every child had the most rich and positive early childhood experience, that every child in America would go to a well-resourced school with teachers who believed in their future and felt responsible to put them on their way. That is a quest that in some communities people are pursuing. In some sectors within communities, people are actually achieving. But for the majority of us, we have to deal with the cards we're dealt, and so we focus on what has been accomplished in such environments that are inequitable. And what we know is that there is a history of Latino families and students pursuing educational equity and higher educational achievement that begins very early. The legal cases that range from 1931 with Roberto Alvarez and the Lemon Grove case, the Mendez and Westminster School District in 1946, Aspira versus the Board of Education in 1972, and Serna and Portales and the Municipal School District in New Mexico in 1974, are just a few of the legal struggles and conquests that have littered the landscape as we pursue this process. The one that is quite personal for me is Lulac versus Richards, Texas in 1987. And it's one which, for those of you interested in higher education, is a precedent to consider as California and other states across the country look at the landscape of opportunity. The case was fundamentally about the distribution of public resources for public higher education throughout the state. And it was shown, with MALDEF leading the effort, that the distribution of resources were inequitable, and that South Texas schools from the border, from El Paso all the way down to Brownsville, had been systematically excluded. We can look today at what has happened since that case was won. The changes really, while the federal resources are one, the state resources are another, the actual pathway to the strategies and institutions rely on the people who are the leadership of academic institutions. The presidents, the chancellors, the deans, the faculty, the students. And in the case of South Texas, as the University of Texas at El Paso celebrated its 100th birthday, President Diana Natalicio reflected on the impact of that legal decision. The MALDEF-LULAC lawsuit became this great gift. She took her position as president the year after the lawsuit was settled. And it created an entirely new climate for us to go in and do what we could. Her answer, our answer, is that an institution, a public institution on the border of El Paso and Juarez, would become a place where the people of that community would find their capacity to be all that they wanted to be. Diana Natalicio is a leader who could go anywhere and chose to stay in El Paso and build strength and structure and scholarship and academic research to serve a community. Hers is a model of the pursuit of equity. One can go to different places and continue to move up the ladder, and that is a very legitimate way to acquire skills and talents. And someone, all of us, can make a choice to say, here is where I will make it happen. As we make the choice of saying Excelencia in education is accelerating Latino student success in higher education, we're going to do it fully aware that institutions of higher education are skilled at exclusion, at weeding out, rather than bringing in, that often are governed by issues of academic prestige that sometimes link to how many students are declined, and admissions rather than the impact of pedagogy, rigor on motivated students. These are variables. They are not requirements. They are options for educational leaders when they make a social contract with the students that they admit. At Excelencia in Education, we're looking for trendsetters. We're looking for academics who can maneuver in an environment of prestige and resources, who can show academic strength and capacity, and who believe, as we do, in the capacity of the higher education sector to be that gateway for equity in this country. Presidents and chancellors committed to making their institutions environments where Latino students thrive. Our methods, our tactics are replicable, using data and analysis to identify the factors that influence the success of specific students, we establish the baseline, what we did at UT, what we did in government, and what we do now. It is information to develop more effective policies, engage diverse stakeholders, enhance the active and tactical responses needed to serve Latino students, but ultimately to find the institutional strength and capacity to truly serve all students. We focus on the practical use of data. We look at the responsibility to address financial needs of all students. We deliver high-touch programs, and those who are able to do that, and to do it for first-generation college-goers. And we challenge the premise that the way we've always done it, traditional students, is a way, but it is not innovation. It is not the new way. And the capacity for institutions of higher education to respond to post-traditional students is the measure of innovation. It is the measure of quality, and it is the set of scholars that we seek to work with. At Excelencia in Education today, we know that a country's most precious resource is its human resource. And so with all that we have been able to do in partnership with academics across the country, with institutional leaders and student affairs professionals, we recognize that the leadership opportunity for an organization such as ours requires that we also frame the discussion nationally. So in the work that we've done, particularly these last 5 years, we've stepped into that space that talks about college completion. I can't imagine anybody in higher education hasn't been tracking whether it was President Obama's commitment to the goal of making America first in the world with citizens who have college degrees, or the Bill and Melinda Gates version with their saying about those who would have college degrees, or the Lumina Foundation's discussion about where we're going to be by 2050 with 60% of Americans having some post-secondary education. For someone like myself, it was our moment. Because as everyone was talking about college completion for the country, we could quietly step into the discussion and say, the only way for this country to achieve national goals for college completion is to have a tactical plan for Latinos. It may not be the starter bell for enlightenment, it may not be the motivator, but it could be the fact that would remain and would be there year after year. That as we navigate a higher education landscape today, which is churning as probably never before, with ideas about analytics and how to use technology and how do we have large-scale change strategies, it still comes back to the question of who is participating, who is succeeding, what is the marriage between our strategies, the needs of the students who come and knock on our doors, and the commitments that individual institutions make when structuring their admissions programs, their retention efforts, their focus on their own accountability as it relates to graduating. That's the moment that equity as a measure of success must be asserted. For those of you for whom this conversation piques your interest, there is a significant body of work called Ensuring America's Future by Increasing Latino College Completion. It quantifies in very specific and direct ways what this country must do for the country to have the talent that we need with college degrees. And within that, we have an analysis of 50 states, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia, so that you can look at California or your home state, and you can see where we fare today, where there is an equity gap, what are strategies that are yielding results. This discussion of equity is active, it is there, and it's on your watch, my watch. This is not a time for any of us to be passive. It is a time for all of us to engage. As people who have a career in higher education, seek to have a career in higher education, the idea of equity, of asking who is being served by what I do, who is choosing to participate in the offerings of my department, of my college, of my university, what role am I playing in capturing this part of the American society and having my institution, my work, help them survive, help them thrive. That is the framing of this discussion of equity for us at Excelencia in education. It is a time when all of us have a role to play. There are a set of skills, but most importantly, there is the opportunity to make common cause. I said this is a year of anniversaries. The pursuit of equity has fueled my work these many years and allowed me to make common cause with inspiring leaders, committed professionals, dedicated educators, smart and tenacious students, and courageous risk-takers, all of them. I thank you for the opportunity to help you recognize the 40th anniversary of the Pullias Lecture by a conversation with you about equity and the seminal role that higher education plays, and more importantly, will play as we achieve this goal together. Muchísimas gracias.
And we are going to engage in a few minutes of discussion. I'm going to go grab a microphone so that Sarita can hear your question. And thank you so much for the wonderful talk. So
thank you.
I'll grab that and she'll talk for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions. So
wonderful.
Thank you.
So while people are thinking what their question is, I personal privilege here, I'd like to introduce Joe Aguirre-Berry, friend and colleague who just recently stepped down from his role as chairman of the Excelencia in Education Board.
All right, who has a question for us? Engage.
We have someone over here. You're going to make her walk.
Okay. Getting my afternoon exercise.
Hello, Sarita. Thank you for coming to the West Coast and for sharing that great history of where Latinos have been coming. We've been here. Just want to get your thoughts. Yesterday, the Department of Commerce just made an announcement. You were talking about the awakening and enlightenment that the nation had about Latinos with the 2010 census. Now we know that there's going to be a citizenship question asked in the census for the 2020 census, and welcome your thoughts. Again, happy that you're here and want to continue that conversation.
I confess that while I've been here, I have not been paying as much attention to the news to know what the specific announcement is. But what I do think is that the discussion about the census and the practice that the country has of taking the census and commenting on the implications of changes is one that all of us should focus on. I'm not in any way philosophically or professionally ever wanting to say that someone's race, ethnicity, place of birth, gender, one-to-one predicts a whole set of things. I think that we are all individuals, fundamentally. That's philosophically what I believe. At the same time, I do know that you can see trends. And those trends are trends that for policymakers, we really do need to monitor. So in terms of the projection of the release of this new census, I think all of us who believe that the growth of human capital, the Latino community, is an asset for this country, need to be ready. Don't let someone else define what those changes are. We need to assert what they are. I mean, when you look under the hood of most of the demographic information and you look at the trend lines, you can see glass half full, glass half empty. I know that when we were doing our work, I'll just give you an example, a lot of the work began with Latinos didn't care, fill in the blank, whichever it was. Latinos didn't care about car safety, or we didn't care about education, or we didn't care. And these were not federal agency representatives who were meaning to be insulting. These were people who were looking at data, and the data was telling them that Latinos weren't participating. And so after the first 3 or 4 times I got through those conversations and I calmed down enough, and I'd say, tell me why you say that. Tell me what it is that you're looking at that makes you think that. And then they would explain, and they would explain that they created some brochure, and they'd even gone to the effort of translating it. Now, they translated it using somebody in their public affairs office using Spanish that not too many people spoke, but nonetheless, it was a brochure, it was a federal brochure that isn't something you probably would read in English, and then they translated it into a Spanish that very few people spoke, and then, remember, this is 97, 98, 99, and then they announced its existence on a website. Now, the digital divide was alive and well, 97 to 2000, so nobody knew it was there. But they were understanding the absence of any action to get that brochure as an indication that people didn't care. We have to, in anticipation of information being shared, frame the data as it truly exists. So I'm not going to pontificate on every question that's asked, because otherwise people won't ask questions. So that's my reaction.
Other questions, just raise your hand and I'll head your direction if I can see you.
Thank you, Sarita, for your comments. I'm Octavio Villalpando, Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion at Cal State LA. I've recently come back to California, to my home, after being out of state for close to 20 years. And one of the most difficult things that I've had to encounter in being part of a state system of higher ed is the reality that we turn away hundreds of thousands of qualified and admissible Latino and Latina students every single year. And those numbers continue to climb. Okay? So a conversation about equity at an institutional level is one thing. A conversation about equity at a larger state level, right, is another thing. And it seems to me that that's an area that really haven't done much work in. I mean, channeling students towards community colleges and keeping our fingers crossed that they'll eventually transfer if that's their goal, right, has been what we've tried to do for the last 30 years. In fact, longer than that, since the creation of the master plan. What are your thoughts about enlarging this conversation about equity to include the thousands of students that get denied admissions but are highly qualified for admissions to those very same institutions?
That we must raise that topic, and we must tether the framing of the question and the conversation to what we're in a position to do. So if we're talking to people in Sacramento about the capacity for, I'm here at USC, but I'm going to talk about public higher education in California to respond, we have a discussion about the arguments that are being made in the business world and in economic terms about the need for college-educated people. Because that's where the schizophrenia comes in big. I mean, it's that, okay, so we've made allocations to higher education, there's not enough seats, there's not enough space, there's not enough, and yet at the same time, across town, we're having conversations about we're going to need these people, and okay, so how do we put those together? That's a conversation we have with people in Sacramento. Now, I don't pretend to just fly in and have the answer, but the dissonance has to be raised up. The challenge, of course, is that the pace of certain decisions are made and the calendar is all out of whack. I mean, you've got young people applying right now, and they need a seat right now, and maybe even you can find leadership in Sacramento that are ready to address that. But even if they hustle like crazy, whatever they do is going to take another 2, 3, 4 years. We live right now in a higher education environment where very entrepreneurial people are saying, concurrent with the aspirations that we are cultivating among students in California to go to California schools, we also have to be talking to all students about the opportunities that are available for them nationally. I think we should. I don't know that many schools, many counselors, many systems are actively doing that in the tactical way that most first-generation college goers need. I know that at Excelencia, we are interacting with very ambitious entrepreneurial people who are asserting that today students live online, they live on their phones, they respond to things that, they're more comfortable, some of them online, and that the arguments that people have been making for the last 15 years, which is that, pick your head up, look outside, look across the country, don't just look at surrounding states. National Public Radio had a big story about the emptying out of institutions in New England and how they're ready to do all kinds of things to bring students there. I think these are somewhat repetitive in terms of phenomenon because we've had this happen before. I, as somebody who still is an old recruiter at heart, my concern will be, okay, so let's say we're going to start telling students from Los Angeles to go to Maine or New Hampshire or wherever, and there's great schools there and wonderful opportunities. What's going to happen to them there? Who are they going to work with? Who are they going to interact with? And when those institutions want our talent, they need to prepare in that way. And I don't have the pithy answer right now. So it wasn't in my comments. But I can tell you that these discussions about the broad-scale changes in higher education, the flow of options for curriculum, for getting degrees, for getting credentials. I have a 15-year-old. I think hard about, am I comfortable with this idea that she won't go to a campus, and she won't be in a classroom, and but who knows? I mean, it's going to be 3 more years. It may be that's what she wants to do. All of this is happening right now. But your question, which is this dissonance, we have to call it out, and we have to call it out in the moment. Because the silos of this discussion about what we say we need in the way of college-educated people, and then our functional performance in the way of a delivery system, they're not linked, they're not aligned, and we have to call it out.
Thank you. That's really exciting to hear from a national perspective how to address some of these state and local issues.
How you doing, Ms. Sarita? Thanks for coming. My name is Charlie. I'm a first year master's student at Rossier. I have a question for you. I appreciate you shedding light on some of the mischaracterizations of the Latino population. And my question is, what advice do you have for emerging Latinos pursuing higher education careers in order to increase unity and gain more allies to bridge the equity gap that exists in higher education?
In terms of someone who's starting, take yourself seriously. Don't take yourself so seriously that you're burdensome, but take yourself seriously. You're making a choice, you're making a commitment with your time and energy. Stay focused on that. As it relates to how to create a degree of camaraderie and how to form a relationship, I think that the natural point of intersection is this question of, do you belong? And you talked, do we belong? And if we belong, why does that feel challenged? And what are you doing to mitigate that? And what can I learn from those tactics and methods? And here are the things that I'm doing. I mean, the work that I did at the very beginning was pretty heart-driven. I did not wake up one morning and say I'm going to have a career in higher education. That wasn't how it all happened for me. I mean, honestly, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And when I started, I took a lot of classes. I did reasonably well. By my sophomore year, I said, you know, I really need to have a major, and I need to have some kind of plan. And so I thought I'll get a teaching certificate. You know, I could teach. And that back then, the requirement was that you took 6 hours of ethnic studies. I wasn't quite sure what that was, but okay. And so I took my first Chicano studies class. And it lit up my life. It gave me a systematic way of looking at the questions of participation and power and structures of society. It was historical. Jose Limon was my professor. And in the process of not only pursuing it in terms of scholarship, I also got involved with the university in minority affairs. And I will tell you that the work that I did with African American students, the people who were involved, I made the comment about the vestiges of segregation. When I was doing my work, there were many students that I was trying to recruit to graduate school whose professors, particularly at historically black colleges and universities, had been prevented from enrolling at UT Austin because of segregation. And my discussion with them about why they should take another chance at this and what they should do, and the conversations about tactics and strategies, all of that absolutely hinged on the empathy between people who were working to participate. And I would imagine that on this campus, the same thing is true. Tactics may be slightly different, and definitely nomenclature. I actually practiced before I came here. I say, was I really going to say Latino, X? No, I probably wasn't. But I actually thought about it because and I mean no disrespect, but the language keeps changing. And what I will tell you, though, is that if any of us gets really hung up on labels, then we probably should not, you know, spend a whole lot of time talking to each other, because you can be so distracted by the label, just like you can be so distracted by the discussion of demography, that you never do anything. And ultimately, it is about what are we doing. And if this issue of who are the students who are participating in your institution, what are their backgrounds, what are their strengths, what are their skills, that is where I think we can have a lot of intersection that happens quite naturally. And there's lots more on that subject for anyone who is interested in pursuing. The conversations about participation, the conversations about equity, I don't have to tell you this, but I will. It's being driven right now by students. Mm-hmm. The discussions that are going on across America of students saying, I want faculty who look like me, I want faculty who think that the issues that compel me are worthwhile, not that to the exclusion of anything else, but they are worthwhile. Students are the people within campuses that are keeping not just the pilot light on, but they're keeping the flame burning. And I think that this part of the next framing of higher education opportunity, it is the time for your needs, for your desires, for your wishes, for your aspirations to be front and center. Because in policy terms, what we are pushing towards is an accountability system that doesn't just look at the numbers of students, it looks at the quality of the experience that students have when they leave. It looks at what they say about their institutions when they leave. It looks at what these institutions do that helps students actually have momentum for first careers. We have a whole body of work right now on workforce that isn't just a vocational discussion. It's much more about the translation of a liberal arts education into a framing and understanding of how to navigate a life going forward. So your opportunity here, if taking yourself seriously, which means doing your homework and knowing the rules of engagement, are very high, because the change that is happening to higher education is not one that is going to go away. It is one where the principles and traditions of higher education will be maintained because they're good and strong, but they will be assessed by a view of student success as we've never experienced before. And that's not just aspirational. I can say that with fact.
Thank you very much. And we have time for one last question.
Thank you very much for your time. Ensuring
America's future.
Ensuring the American future. And your perspective in regards to reach national higher education goals, the engagement of Latinos is critical. Interesting perspective, especially with the demographic changes that are happening in some of our cities. I work at California State University, Dominguez Hills. What some may see as critical or as an opportunity, others may see as a threat or may be divisive. You look at the demographic changes that have happened in Compton, in Carson, on our campus that is now currently 64% Latino. Some other historically underrepresented populations don't see an opportunity for partnership, but see an opportunity for how do we protect ourselves. What is your advice or resources that you could point us to so that we could start the discussion that engaging all and empowering all is a pathway to also engaging in America's future?
It is a legitimate worry for any group. How will I belong? So if an institution is focused on anything and you're not part of that group, what does that mean about me? Yours is a campus, Cal State Dominguez Hills, that is one of the case studies for this question, because a previous president, Jim Lyons, was a person who, as a previous president of a historically black college and university, proudly talked about being the president of a Hispanic serving institution, and talked about the dynamic of a leadership opportunity to both assert that moniker, HSI, which we've not talked much about, and I hope if anyone's interested in it, we'll talk about it over lunch, and the history of a place like Dominguez Hills. The premise was, where is there commonality? So the principles of first-generation college-goers, what it's like for the parents of students who did not go to college and who, on faith, are sending their students to do this. How, as an institution, do you engage them? And whether you do it in Spanish or you do it in English, the premise, which is I'm worried about how Mijo's going to do, and I'm not quite sure where she's going to go on Sunday to church, and I'm not, those qualities, those human qualities, and intentionally raising them as representatives of the institution is a means to begin to address it. The power dynamics of an institution, as it seeks to look at how it wants to represent itself publicly, and how even you navigate a historical role of what your institution used to be 20 years ago and what it is now. It's the reason why, even though we're working at a national level, and even though our publications are national or large in scope, we will repeatedly run up and down because it's a human enterprise. It's not just the framing of it in policy terms. It's not just looking at, let's look at households and what's the composition of the area. It's also what you and your colleagues are intentionally creating as a learning environment. Lots more to say on that with very good people across the country who face very similar things.
Thank you so much. And if you'll join me in thanking Sarita for her wonderful remarks. And we invite you now for a lunch.